Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out on a rainy night. However, for an Alaskan, this is just like nothing, right?
This is like the weather at home. It's like the weather at home.
So Dana's down for her annual winter break from Homer, Alaska, to spend a little time with us. And we're excited that on January 11th, we're going to be premiering No Fixed Line, which is the 22nd Kate Shupak book.
Yeah.
So tell us a bit about it.
I don't know. I'm working on another book now, and I can hardly remember what that one is about.
Well, let's see.
Remind me.
I can help since I edited it. Right. Let's talk about your experience raising money for Story Knife, because that is actually the inspiration of the plot.
I started a nonprofit, and naturally, it is the tendency of crime fiction writers everywhere that instantly, when they find something good, they try to figure out how to pervert it. To an evil cause, which I must say I did do in spades. It was, there's a plane crash in the park, and a large quantity of drugs are found up in the mountains in the middle of a blizzardy snowstorm, and everything sort of evolves from there. I don't really want to talk too much about it.
Well, we could mention that Jack's wife, former wife, comes back into the picture, because it's been a long time since we've seen her.
Well, yeah, and she never was dealt with properly, I didn't think, so I thought this was a good chance to pay off her character.
For those of you who have read the series, I could remind you that Kate decided to deal. Patrick, can you speak to Alexis?
I thought I heard some music. Alexa, stop.
Thank you. Our fear is that we're going to have an author named Alexis here one night. And we're going to have a really horrible time. I'm going to give her a pseudonym. Thank you. In any case, remember Kate, for those of you who may have read it, Kate decided to deal with, I'm sorry, what's her name? Jane, right?
No, Jane Morgan, yes.
Yeah,
Jane Morgan is Johnny's birth mother, and Johnny is Kate's adopted son.
Right, married to Kate's lover, now deceased. But anyway, Kate dealt with her in a particularly interesting way, fiendish way. But you're right, that is, I won't spoil it if you haven't read that particular thing, but you're right. That was, then she just kind of stayed in Anchorage while everybody else was doing other stuff.
When Kate's mortal enemy brought her back, basically, in his inimitable fashion, Erwin Bannister decided, okay, he was really going to stick it to Kate, so he was going to employ Jane Morgan and make Kate deal with her.
Yes.
And Kate does. In a way, I'm sure Mr. Bannister never expected, at least I hope.
Very true. And this is a book in which we're spending time in Anchorage, a lot of the time instead of in the park too, which makes it a little
all over the
different.
place. I mean, Jim has a plane. Jim, Kate's main squeeze, roommate, has a new 206, a new Cessna 206, and so they climb into it and do a lot of sleuthing, basically by air. They go and fly to a lot of different locations that don't have roads. It's the only way they can get in. And their location is also a reason that they are a subject of Kate's investigation. I'm using Alaska's geography to the benefit of the crooks.
Yes, you do. And actually, your dad was a pilot, right? So you know
He was a bush pilot. Yeah.
You know a lot about bush
I'm not a
pilot.
pilot myself. I'm not. I don't make no claims for that. But I have flown in the right seat an awful lot.
Well, I think it really gives the books a very authentic feeling, you know, because have any of you ever flown in a bush plane? No. Any of you ever want to fly in a bush plane? Probably not, right? Dana once made me a handsome offer when I was staying with her that I could go to see real bears in Alaska, because there was a small plane guy, right, that would fly me from Homer into the heart of bear country where I could or could not emerge alive, right? When it was all over.
He hasn't lost anybody yet.
I've been across Kachemak Bay with Bena a couple of times, and we've gone clamming, and we've been down on the beach with eagles, and but I haven't actually gone into bear country. And describe to us what Suicide by Alaska, what that portends, because it comes
doesn't have
up.
anything to do with flying, Barbara.
It has to do with bears.
These people are never going to get near a plane again.
Sorry, I was with bears. I'd made the switch, but I didn't. Seriously. In fact, one of your books has that opportunity for people to face up to bears when the bears wake up in the spring. And
Well, yes, yeah. I mean, a guy in my hometown got attacked by a bear here just like 2 weeks ago. So
really?
because it's a really warm winter, it's the bears they haven't gone to sleep yet, and they might not even at all this winter. So yeah, a guy was walking a couple of his dogs and was attacked by a bear with 2 cubs.
Which kind of a bear?
It was brown. I think it was a grizz.
So it wasn't a grizzly.
No, it was a grizz.
Oh, it was.
Black aren't grizz, brown are.
Okay.
Yeah.
And probably not ever going to be a tame grizzly bear.
Well,
No.
I mean, no, I don't think so. I don't believe in tame wild animals. I'm sorry, I've been around too many wild ones in my life.
So, talking about the climate warming up and so forth, while we're filling in here waiting for Laurie, what's going on with the communities up around the edges of, up north around, where the sea ice is melting and their
They're
whole way
falling into the Beaufort Sea.
is that?
Essentially, yeah.
So it really is going to screw up their whole way of life, isn't
No,
it?
it's screwing up their whole way of life. Yeah, yes. The U.S. Coast Guard is, I think it's, from what I understand from a friend of mine, the U.S. Coast Guard is like full bore into plans for putting a base in Barrow now, because the world shipping companies are going to start coming over the top instead of going the Great Circle route. So, yeah.
It's a lot faster to go across the top of Russia than to go all the way around. So you can see that. Rob and I did the Northwest Passage cruise, the first one when Crystal opened it up. There she is.
Yeah.
And you could see that because they had hired an icebreaker and everything to deal with. Remember the whole terrible story of the people who died? And they didn't need it. So it was perfect. I know you're here. We're going to move you up
Did
there
you
in
have a
just 1
question?
second.
Excuse me, ma'am.
Teacher.
Ma'am, in the purple shirt, did you have a question?
Yeah. I want to know when Kate is going to get exciting again.
Is that Kate Martinelli?
You want to hand me my clothes? I'm sorry, I draped them on your seat. All right, you can have a microphone too, right? Wait, you need to. I don't think it's on.
That's okay. I can do that.
You can do that. You sure? All right. So we were just discussing the fact that the shipping lanes are going to move way up north and go across the top. See? Here.
And Barbara was bad mouthing bush violence.
I was not. I was bad mouthing bears. Here we go.
The bears.
Bears.
Come on now.
All right.
Now
Well, all right. That ends the Alaska segment of our program.
So I can get down.
You can get down.
Yes.
All right. You're all set. All right.
Very little to say about Alaska, except it's really beautiful. I think
Right.
it's rich.
So instead, we're going to talk about San Francisco and a small town in California, roughly a 2-hour drive away.
Yeah.
In which direction? Because I never did quite figure that
It's
out.
a kind of Central Valley-ish, like Merced area.
Okay.
I mean, flat and boring.
Right. So how many of you have read a Kate Martinelli book story? Oh, okay. Great. So you remember Grave Talent, which is what kicked off the whole Kate Martinelli series, but was not actually the first book Laurie wrote. It was the first book that Laurie
But
published.
it was interesting. I mean, I've been involved with the crime world now for a long time, and it's interesting what is popular and what gets the prizes. And sometimes they are similar, and other times they are not. So I have had of 5 Kate Martinelli books, 2 of them have been nominated for an Edgar, and one of them I was secretly told by somebody who shouldn't have told me, missed by 1 point. So that's 3 out of 5. Is considerable, and none of the Russell books have ever been nominated for an Edgar, which I find fascinating. But
Commercial
yeah,
does not equal critical success and
No,
vice versa.
no, it's been really interesting. And as somebody who has not only sat on one of the committees judging an Edgar, but has actually chaired it, it's been fascinating to watch the process, because I'm the chair of the committee, and I make sure that all my 5 judges are all very balanced, and they're from this coast and that coast, and women and men. And what did we have? 5 male writers were nominated that year, which was really fascinating. Anyway, it has nothing to do with Kate Martinelli, except Kate Martinelli won the Edgar Award for Best First Novel in its year, and I don't think that Beekeeper's Apprentice would have. So it was, as an accident, completely accidental. It was an interesting way to start a career because I started with a prize, and then I went with the second book was BQ's
Was the big
Apprentice.
seller, right?
And that was the one that has been consistently for 25 years a big seller. There's a new edition of it, in fact, which the only change in it is it's instead of saying 20th anniversary, it says 25th.
It's actually more than that.
It's 25 this year.
Is it this year? 'Cause
Yeah.
I thought, oh, I see. I'm still
Yeah.
thinking of the 20th one. I
Yeah.
forgot to make the leap.
Yeah, no, we're 25.
All
So
right.
yeah. So, it's been a really interesting combination of. I mean, there are people who love the Kate books. I mean, severely love the Kate books. I'm sure none of you are here, right?
I like
And
Right. So a long time ago, I remember asking.
I'm still the one that's new, since I've not written the series, I got the first book of the series, I like to read them in chronological order if possible.
okay.
Why not? So, a long time ago, I remember asking Laurie whether Kate Martinelli was always going to be a lesbian in her imagination or why she was. And Laurie's reply I thought was really interesting. Do you remember it?
What was my reply?
Your reply was that you wanted her to have a working relationship with another cop and you didn't want romance to be a part of it, and so the easy solution to partner her up with Al was, to make her more interested.
Yeah, that makes
in
it sound
women.
really deliberate and as if I know what I'm doing.
Well, I
Whereas
thought you
actually,
did.
I mean, a lot of these things, and it's the same way that I use an outline in a book, is I use it as an analytical tool to say, why did I do something, and what is it that I've done here, and what's missing for my outline.
Right.
But in terms of the decision about whether I should make her gay, I think that it was always part of her personality, but looking back at it, I think one of the reasons I went that way, completely unconsciously, was that I wanted her to have a friendship. I wanted her to have a friendship with her older partner, and I didn't want it to go into the direction that I could tell that Russell and Holmes were going in. And it's really, it is difficult to write a man-woman friendship in a book without getting into the unresolved sexual tension field.
Right.
And I
In
thought,
fact, if I remember right, we also talked about the fact that Russell and Holmes were not originally intended to be a romantic partnership, but it just went that way.
I don't remember that,
I
but
have-
I'll take it, okay?
I have an encyclopedic memory of what Laurie has said to me for 25 years. And the reason I brought it up is that Laurie, in a way, was way ahead of her time, because today there is a tremendous amount of literature that is directed toward, or is embracing the whole, I never get the initials right, LGBT community. So, it's fascinating to me that, you are now fashionable, so to speak, with Kate Martinelli, and who knew?
I waited my whole life to be fashionable. I think that the thing that really impresses me with the Martinelli books is that, I started writing them not really thinking about the fact, and of course 30 years ago we didn't think about these facts, that I had no right to write a book with a main character who was lesbian, because I'm not. A lot of people assume I am, but I think I know myself well enough to know that I'm not.
I knew Laurie's husband for 30 years, so,
Which,
I
it
attest
doesn't
to
really
that.
mean anything, but on the other hand, I think, to my mind, it's been amazing how generous the LGBTQ community, if there is such a thing as a community, has been with my just assumption that I could write these books. And in fact, they even gave one of them a Lambda Award, which is their highest honor. And I think it has often entered the discussion that is now, a lot of people are talking about, do I have the right to write about a black character if I'm not black? A Native American character if I'm not? This business of having to stick within your community is a fascinating discussion, and I don't think that I'm right. I don't think that I'm wrong. I just find it really fascinating, and how somehow or other the Kate series sort of didn't enter into that discussion.
Well, cultural appropriation, which is sort of a technical word for all of this that's going on, is a relatively recent phenomenon. But I mean, if you go back through, centuries of great literature, nobody thought about cultural appropriation. They wrote whatever characters, were necessary for the story or interested them. And I'm hoping that this is a phenomenon that will soon pass in our age of extremism, that, it will go away.
Yeah, I think that it's the discussion is certainly justified. The discussion is one that we need to have, but the conclusions are maybe not the main part of it.
Right. And the other reason I brought it up was that we start out with Kate and her wife. And, it's been a long-term relationship. It's been, 30 years or something like that?
Yeah, it's set in 2015, so their daughter is now 15. And it was a lot of fun writing that because, when you last met them, it was 2004, I think it was. And the huge changes that have taken place in San Francisco, in California society, in the world in general, I found really interesting. The other thing that I found really interesting was that this is a first person.
Right.
This is the only Martinelli, and I think if I write a novel, it will go back to third person. But this one I started it and I thought, why am I writing first person? That's Russell's voice. But it just seemed to fit with this particular story about her past.
Well, but she's not working this case because she's a cop. She's working this case because it's a piece of her past.
Yeah.
And therefore having her tell the story as a first, whatever, would fit it. Whereas if she were, out on the city streets and caught a case, so to speak, then it's a different ballgame.
It's also as a writer, first person has some peculiar limitations that are very handy because you are limited. You can't see in general what's going on out there. And if you are writing a story about one person's assumption of what is true as opposed to what turns out to be true, first person really goes well with that. Mm-hmm. That it is her journey from I know what happens to oh my God, what happened?
Well, it's a filter. It's an absolute filter. It also is challenging you as a writer to how do you bring information into the story if only your narrator can know it or see it. So the unreliable narrator really has to be a first person one, right?
Yeah, and I think that I had a lot of fun experimenting with that in Locked Rooms, which is a Mary Russell story that she is an unreliable narrator, which was, she is the most reliable person in the world, and yet her memory was flawed in this, and so it necessitated bringing in Holmes's voice as the voice of rationality and reality.
Yeah.
So I started writing Holmes, which started to interest me a lot more. So that the new book I'm working on has 3 separate tracks, and these are supposed to be memoirs, not the Martinellis, but the Russell books, which you won't see those till June. But they're supposed to be memoirs. They're supposed to be first person, and yet this book has gotten into several third person tracks. So anyway,
all interesting stuff for a writer. So if you want to tell a story where you're going to open up the past and have a cold case, so to speak, which is what's happening here, you're almost forced to have some voice from the past or something from the past presented to you, and oftentimes that comes in the discovery of a letter or a diary or a document or something. So in fact, what Kate, that's what happens here.
Yeah, you have to have some kind of trigger of why she would start to question her assumption.
Well, she needs a voice of her sister to speak up.
Yeah, and in the very first book, in Grave Talent, you found that when she was an undergraduate at Berkeley, her sister was killed, and this was a trauma, obviously. But that's all you knew about it, and that's all anyone knew about it, and that's what Kate assumed. It was this accident, and that was all, until little tiny questions start popping up, which involve her daughter and her own assumptions. So,
Let's be honest and say that was all you knew about it too back when you wrote it.
yeah. Well, I think obviously from a writer's point of view, as soon as you decide you want to write on something, you know that this is not going to be an accident.
No, but
So-
I mean back when you wrote the first Kate Martinelli, you didn't have any reason to
No.
do more with her sister than
No.
just say,
Yeah.
she died and it was a tragedy and
Mhm.
and like that. So you hadn't probably thought
No.
the whole thing through. Why would you?
No, it wouldn't. And it was one of those things too that you have to be really careful when you go through to make sure that the new book you're writing doesn't contradict the old one.
Right.
Which I'm forever doing with the Russells and thinking, oh God.
Laurie actually read that to me. Dana and I are going off to Egypt on a research trip week after next, and I said I want to get the Amelia Peabody. I'm going to pick my two favorites, the crocodile and the sandbank, and the last camel died at noon. And I'm going to take them along, because this is our Amelia Peabody trip. And Laurie then pointed out to me, well, you tell it because you're the one who found it.
Do you know the Elizabeth Peters Amelia
Yes.
Peabody books? Well, in all the books, she's small and very round. She's voluptuous,
Buxom,
but
yeah.
she's small because people are forever picking her up, and she hates the fact that she's small. But in the first book, she is similarly buxom, but she's tall. It specifically says, "I'm too tall for fashion."
Right.
So somewhere between book 1 and book 2, she lost a foot.
Right. And Laurie remembered that, and then so I challenged her, and so she took my copy I just purchased right from the store, and she read me, "I'm too tall." I thought, oh, shit. But
Yeah.
said there was obviously not a continuity editor at work there. But,
Yeah, it's the kind of thing that as a writer you hope nobody notices, because and you can see what happened to her, that she decided that the physical image of a strong, tall, competent woman didn't fit with the personality that she ended up with. So she had to just kind of pretend that.
Right. No, it was very illustrative. So anyway, we have Kate, and she now has been a cop for a long time. She's married. She's got a child, and all of a sudden, this whole question of her sister comes back up, which also brings around the fact that their mother was an extremely difficult person, and Kate really had a very difficult childhood, and Berkeley represented an escape to her.
Yeah, and I think that too is one of those things that as a writer you tend to throw in the difficult family background, because that's something that fills out the background of your character. But I had never really had reason to explore any of that.
Right.
But yes, it was interesting coming up with the kind of relationships that she would have in 2015, because the first book was set in the late 80s. I wrote it in maybe 88, 89. And so it was first published in 93. And a lot of things obviously have changed. And one of those things, of course, is the thing that always, whenever there's been talk of a television series, they have to get their heads around how she could be a closeted lesbian in San Francisco now. and I mean, you'd have to be pretty phobic to have a grave talent and those attitudes in modern times. But in the years since the last one, obviously Al Hawken is still around, but he wouldn't be a cop anymore, a full-time cop, because they age out, and so he's now working cold case, which is really convenient. As Mike Connolly is discovering, you can do all kinds of things with cold case people.
Right.
You can explore all kinds of things. You have the pressure is somewhat off because anything you're doing is an improvement on what's going on. And so, and Al is very convenient for this particular case because she doesn't think it's a cold case, and yet it kind of maybe is. So,
Well, when you say that, she begins to wonder whether her sister's death was truly just an accident. But because it was so traumatizing for her to have left home and then have to go back and, you know, break away again, that she's kind of suppressed the whole thing. So I thought that was very realistic. Anyway, so this thing arises, and Kate has to think about it, and then conveniently she has to go interview a witness in a place very close to the town that she grew up in, this small town.
You're allowed a coincidence in a book if it doesn't matter.
Well, that's two already that we've named,
Yeah.
so you're pushing it, but nonetheless. So I thought one of the most interesting things about the book, and this is a shorter book. This is a novella, not a very long novel. Is the contrast between Kate working as a cop in San Francisco, in other words, you know, an urban environment, a city and all, and then suddenly she's down in a small town where the dynamics are really different. Plus, she's not a part of the police force down there, and so she has to deal with the fact that they may not want, the local police may not want her inquiring into what happened. I mean, because this is long gone and long settled. So I thought, you know, that was a really interesting contrast. Is this the first case she's worked out of the city? Because it's been so long since I've read the last one.
Well, the very first one had the first death that she investigates in her first case with the SFPD is actually in the outskirts of Santa Cruz. So it's well south of San Francisco. But because the cases are obviously all tied together, they bring in the SFPD. But this one too, you know, it's a small. It's when I first started writing the Martinellis, I had written 2 Russells, and I wanted to write one that was slightly more realistic. And so I thought, well, I'm going to have to set it in a modern time, in a more believable Sherlock Holmes. A more believable.
Hey, he lives.
Yeah.
He's immortal.
Setting, and I thought at the time, well, I can't set this in the area that I live in, because I was at that point living in Watsonville, which had one murder every 2 years, and it was always somebody you knew who had done it. Was either, you know, a husband killing his wife or one of the local gangs shooting each other. So there was not really a great cause in Watsonville in the 90s for a huge investigatory department. So I moved it to San Francisco because of that, because she would have you know, the background of this entire department. But moving out of the country again, when you're back into the fictional town of Diamond Lake, you have a sheriff's department who is handling drunks and meth labs, and that's sort of it. And the requirements for subtle investigations are not as everyday as they are in San Francisco.
They wouldn't even have a cold case department in a place that small, would they?
No, they'd have cases that never closed.
Right.
But you wouldn't have a special unit working on it, no.
Right. So there is reluctance to even look at this, you know, automobile accident again. But when Kate starts to look at it, there are anomalies that suggest that maybe it wasn't quite this straightforward. All right, and that's all we're going to say. Automobile accident, that it was.
Yeah, without doing spoilers here, but yeah.
Right. No, but I mean, I did think that was, you know, really an interesting. For her in 2015 to have to go back and look how a case was handled years ago was another interesting
thing. I
thing.
think that you know, a cop in her situation, on the one hand, any cop wants to have the right answer. On the other hand, this is a personal thing. And she's also got her teenage daughter who has sort of dragged her, and she would like nothing better than to say to her teenage daughter, it was just a really sad accident, and let it go at that. But in all honesty, she can't, you know, each step she takes, she realizes that she's further down that path of, no, it really wasn't just an accident.
So back to Mary Russell, you have a book coming out in June called Riviera Gold. Now I mentioned my sweater, but I realize now that we were actually not in Romania, but in the B town, Bulgaria. Sorry, I'm having a hard time there. We stopped we got off the ship in Bulgaria to go do something, and as is often the case, merchants tend to arrive at the dock, right, with various stuff to sell you, which is where I bought my $12 shirt,
Oh, yeah.
which,
Yeah.
right, remember that. But anyway, at the end of this trip, we went on, Laurie and I and Rob went on to Vienna, and then Rob and I went a different direction, and Laurie went to Monaco so that she could research her new Kate Russell book. So,
Kate
Mary Russell. So, surprisingly, you know, Kate Russell would really
Yeah,
be
Kate
an
Russell.
interesting idea. You did
I
that
did
with
that.
the Art
That
of
was
Detection.
awesome. Yeah.
Alrighty, right.
Yeah.
So, anyway, Riviera Gold is based upon your stay in part. In part, is
Yeah.
based on your stay in Monaco.
It was a really fascinating trip because we were 3 weeks on a river cruise, roughly.
Over two, and then we were in Vienna.
Yeah, and it was a couple days tacked on at the beginning, and then a couple days
Right.
at the end. But I had just no assumptions. I hadn't been on a cruise. I hadn't been in Eastern Europe, and I just thought, hey, why not? And so we started out in Romania, which is one of the poorer countries in the common market, and you know, saw farming done with horses and people riding carts drawn with horses, and you know,
possibly one of the best bookstores we've ever been in
Yeah.
the capital in Bucharest.
And I just loved Romania. I
magnificent.
thought it was just,
Me
I
too.
mean, especially considering where they've come out of. They had been horrible years with Ceausescu. But, you know, the people themselves, I just wanted to love them all. But, so we went up river and, you know, then went
all
to...
the way to Budapest.
Yeah, and then we went to Vienna, and then they went off to the book fair, and I flew down to Nice and to Monaco. And it was so bizarre because this trip that had started out with, you know, gypsy farmers on horse-drawn wagons, I drive up to my hotel in Monaco, and there's a dozen bright red Lamborghinis.
Yes, it was a tech revolution
It was,
right there.
yeah, it was, you know, just such a, and I thought this is great. So,
Was that your first time in Monaco?
yeah,
And it rained?
it did.
Sort of like Phoenix
Yeah,
today,
yeah.
and yesterday?
Yeah, it's
Right.
stuff that comes out of the air.
You're not
I'm from
familiar
California.
with that.
We
Oh,
don't do that. I don't know what this
Exactly.
stuff is.
So what were you looking at? And describe what you
Well,
would discuss as
the-
a research trip. What would you look for?
It's one of those things like I had mentioned in an earlier book that they had adventures in Japan, and the reason I did that was so I had to go to Japan.
Another
So,
trip that
yeah,
we took.
Yeah,
Right.
so we went to Japan, and so I could write Dreaming Spies and the rest of it. But in not the last, but the last before Russell book, The Murder of Mary Russell, I mentioned that Mrs. Hudson is setting off for. She doesn't say I'm going to Monaco. She says I've always been fond of Monte Carlo, and that's the only hint that Russell has. So Russell sets off from Vienna and ends up in Monte Carlo to find Mrs. Hudson, and finds many other things as well. So I kind of needed to go down to the Riviera for that purpose.
Or actually up to the Riviera if you were going from Vienna.
But
So
we were coming.
that's a complicated thing. My little Australian author that was here 2 weeks ago, I don't know if any of you came to see her, but she's absolutely lovely, and I'm editing her 10th manuscript in which much of the action takes place in Boston, but they have to go to New York. So I'm reading along, and then suddenly they announce that they're going from Boston up to New York. And then a little bit later, they're in New York, and they announced they're going to go down to Boston. And I said, sorry, you have it upside down, but then you lived upside down. You know, you're the other below the equator. So
Except-
that's the kind of thing that, you know,
Except one goes up to Oxford from
from London. That's
So-
true, and it's the wrong direction, isn't it?
And
Right,
Maine is
'cause
down
it
But
is north.
it is.
Maine is down east.
It is a
Okay.
value
That's
judgment,
what's-
not
Nonetheless, if
geographic.
you're reading a book and they're in
Absolutely.
Boston and they announce they're going up to New York, it would
It's
catch your
probably-
attention, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. So I always sort of like that. But anyway, so from Vienna, you went up to Monaco.
Or
Or
I got on a
sideways.
plane. Does it
You
matter?
went
With a
sideways.
plane, does it matter which way you're going? You
Talk
can't.
about
No.
Just need to go up.
Okay.
All right, so what were you looking for in Monaco? Are you just generally walking the streets to get
Yeah.
a feeling, or are you looking
Yeah.
for anything
And of course,
specific?
in Monaco, it's only 5 miles wide, and so
Is it that
you
big?
can walk. You can walk the place in half an hour. You couldn't actually. I mean, theoretically, you could if there weren't any little tiny windy roads and bridges that you can't go on and the rest of it. But in practice,
It's
it
very
takes,
small.
It takes you longer. But the whole city is very, very. The principality is this big, and which was really interesting in itself because there's no reason for it to be there except that the various powers around it found it convenient to have this kind of third party between France and Italy.
Plus, it was a great place to go gambling.
Yeah. And what I found interesting is there was a series of 3 very powerful, very clever women who are responsible for modern Monaco. One of them sent somebody off to look at the way they ran spas and gambling establishments in Germany, and they patterned it on Hamburg. The other one was this American woman who brought in the Ballet Russe and the opera, and then the modern one in the 20s, who renovated the country and made it something that not just the old fuddy-duddies liked. So you have this series of women who all sort of behind the scenes changed this little country into something enormously powerful.
I will never forget, the only time I've ever been in Monaco, I was 15 years old and I was in Europe with my grandmother. It was 1955, so Europe was not in very good shape, right? And so we're in Monaco, because it's one of the stops, and everybody is going to go to I'm the only underage person in this group. And they all want to go to the casino, and I'm not going to be left behind, right? So I have this blue raincoat with whatever it is, and so I borrowed this big blue scarf, and I had my sunglasses, and so I snuck into the casino, where I didn't gamble because I thought it might expose me. But the thing that really caught me was that, after all the Hollywood presentations, of palaces and all the rest of it, it's tiny, and it was really shabby. And I was so disappointed. I thought I was wandering in, to this glorious den of iniquity, and it was all so exciting, because I was 15 and the whole bit. And I looked around, and it was just, because I'd been in Las Vegas, it was just so...
Well, it's improved somewhat now.
I
We've
hope
tidied
so.
it up a lot.
Well,
but it is interesting because it's small. I
Yeah.
mean, compared with the big places in Germany and so forth,
right.
it's a little jewel box of a place. I mean, it's not to
It
my
wasn't,
taste,
right.
but it has this really interesting intimacy about it that you don't get in the bigger places.
And also an incredibly high per capita income, because there's
Well, yeah.
so much money
Yeah.
there. It's just wildly
Yeah.
disproportionate.
Yeah.
Right.
So-
So you're going to pitch Russell into Monaco, but back before it became.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, in 1925, which is before Elsa Maxwell discovered it 2 years later. So she came in and renovated the way, brought in the 20s and made it hip again. But this is this lovely period where Sarah and Gerald Murphy have just discovered the Riviera, and they come down and they're living there year round, which is very unusual for Europeans or Americans. But they discovered it and stayed on past the winter popular time, and you get this influx of all of the English and American writers who made second homes in Paris, and they would all come down. I mean, Hemingway and Fitzgerald and all the rest of them made their sort of second home in the Riviera area for just this lovely couple of years until it was discovered and spoiled.
Oh, it sounds fabulous.
Yeah.
Right. So we'll hope that Laurie actually finishes it. We get to see it in June, right?
It's more or less finished. It's being tweaked. So. And it has a cover, so therefore it must exist.
So I have one more question to ask Laurie, and then we will open things up to you. Beginnings is a book that Laurie decided to self-publish So my question is, what did you learn from self-publishing?
Well,
It was an adventure, right?
yeah, I mean, I've always known that I'm not cut out for self-publishing because it's far too much work. But in this case, I had a daughter and a brother-in-law who who really wanted to take on this project, and so I said, okay, I'll write it and you guys do it. Well, because between one thing and another, it just sort of ended up being far more work than any of the three of us could manage. And it was just oddly unsatisfactory. I mean, you would think that it would be a labor of love, and it was just an irritant one after the other. The way it wasn't published correctly all on the same day, and people couldn't get the ebooks, and people couldn't get this, and now they can't. It's self-publishing is a whole different world, and it's not something that I would. I'm very grateful for being a traditional published author at this point because it's far too much work for me.
I think it depends on the person, but
Yeah.
I know that you had high hopes that it was going to be more fun than it turned out to be.
It was fun. I enjoyed writing it, and I enjoyed some of the stuff like the cover and that kind of stuff that we did. It just seemed so inefficient compared with just handing it to somebody to do.
It's sort of like having it's like house cleaning, it's a lot more efficient than
Yeah.
you hire somebody to go in and do it.
So
Right.
I am in awe of people who can do that. I mean, I have a number of.
Well, I
friends who
guess
do.
I was being more, which parts of I know the writing part, we're leaving that out, but which parts of the other process were the most time consuming? Was it just,
It's really tough to edit your own stuff. Really, really tough. Both for the content and for just the fiddly things like dropped articles and misspellings and the rest of it. And I went through it time and again. I had 6 different friends read through it, and all those 6 people came up with 6 different sets of mistakes. I mean, there were only like 2 mistakes that more than 3 of them caught, which you'd think, this is really worrying. So if there's other things in there, let me know, because we're still fixing things. But it just never seemed to really get off my plate. When I'm with because I'm with Random House, and so I finish that book and I send it off, and then I know I'm gonna get it back at a certain point with this and this to do, and then I'm gonna get the proofs. And after that, I don't have to ever read it again. Never have to look at it again if I don't want to. And this one, it was like, this, you get something on your hands and you just can't bloody get rid of it. I love this book, but it was such a pain. But, I really, if I had known how much work it was going to be, I probably would have just put it up, as an ebook on my site and said, enjoy it, everybody, because,
everybody has a different experience. There have been plenty of authors who've really enjoyed the whole process, and also I think it's just like writing. There's no right way to write a book, and obviously I think there's no perfect way to self-publish a book either, but it is something to think about, that if you're going to take on the production and the business side in addition to the writing side, it's a much bigger time commitment than if you are writing a book. And then there's the lost opportunity thing, which is while you're doing all that, you could have actually written something else. So those are decisions that I think every writer has to make as you move along.
Yeah, and I think that had I not had a deadline for Riviera Gold, staring down my neck, it might have been less of a burden. But because I had this book, I had to write it, and I had a deadline, and I really wasn't willing to not have a book for another year.
Right.
I work 100-hour weeks regularly, so what can I say?
Well, I'm delighted that you finished it and that we have it
Yeah.
here. So do any of you have questions you would like to ask Laurie about anything? Yes, ma'am.
So you were talking about starting writing in the 80s, right? What did you do before that? Because you have a theology.
What did I do before I started writing?
Did I have a theology degree? Did you have a life?
Did I have a life? What did I do?
You were a mom.
Yeah, I was a mom. I had 2 kids born in 1980 and 1983, and I finished my MA thesis before that, so it's too difficult to do a PhD with small kids and a husband who's looking at retirement with longing. So I finished my MA when I think my daughter was one or two, and I started writing The Beekeeper's Apprentice when my son went off to preschool 3 whole mornings a week.
Hey, that was liberation.
I know, it was serious time, 3 mornings a week, and I wrote Beekeeper, and I wrote what became the third in the series, and then I wrote Grave Talent. So, and by the time I looked at actually having to produce an income, I was already actually selling some books, so I never had to really work.
So the point is, you never had a real job.
Well, I have had real jobs, but not supporting a family real job.
No,
I supported myself. I ran a coffee store for a number of years, so I have many strong opinions on coffee.
So when did you go to England then to do all your research?
My
Mary?
husband was Anglo-Indian, so he had a house in Oxford. He had 4 kids, three of them more or less in England, various places. So I sort of had, that was my second home for a while. We never lived there for longer than about 6 months at a pop, but we went there regularly.
Are you married?
Am I
Are you married?
married or married?
Married. Are you married?
She's much cleverer than I am.
Also younger.
Yeah. Her hair never falls off her head. It's just,
Right. Maybe this would be a good moment, Patrick, after you threw the photo, we could wish our video audience goodbye and thank you for joining us for a particularly disjointed program, but that's how it is.